So allow me to introduce myself. I'm Prati. Alongside Lisman, I am a co-steward for the LCI at East Asia project, and we are glad to have you here with us in this event. I'm also a ground staff worker with FES Singapore, where I'm heading a department overlooking several campus ministries. So, allow me to introduce our first speaker for today, Dr. Mike Brownett. I'm going to read off his profile on the Faraday Institute. So, Mike Brownett is a course director at the Faraday Institute, and he obtained his first master's degree in physics and then his PhD in experimental quantum mechanics from Imperial College London. And then I'm going to fast forward because he has got quite an illustrious career. So he completed a second master's degree, a master's in arts in theology from the University of Chester in UK, considering how faith is understood by various parties in discourse on the relationship between Christianity and science. So you can see why he would be quite an insightful speaker to join us today. Since 2015, he's worked at the University of Hong Kong, serving as Associate Director of the Faith and Science Collaborative Research Forum, and he also heads Every Nation Campus Academics, a church-based organization seeking to engage with academics globally. And as if that is not enough, in his spare time, he is working on a PhD with University of Birmingham on the philosophy of science and religion. So it gives me great delight. Mike, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Thank you for the introduction. Um, Now I have to see if I can share a screen. Does this work? Uh, so hopefully you can now see a set of slides. So, um, so what I wanted to talk to you today was about how we think Christianly within the secular academy. I've spent my entire career within non-Christian universities, and often I face this question that says, well, okay, you can be a Christian at home and in your church, but what do you do when you step onto campus? How do you interact with students? How do you interact with your research in a secular academy? What place does Christianity have, if any? Um, Now, when I'm talking to academics, when I'm sort of trying to provoke in them a response, with Christian academics, I generally have two questions. I talk to lots of academics in lots of different fields, whether that's in the arts, in science, in engineering. I'm not an expert in most of those fields, but I have two questions that work essentially in any subject. One is, what are you doing? What's your research? What are you working on? And people know the answer to this question. I work on building bridges or spectrum analyzers or art history. And what does God think about it? And often people aren't so clear on the answer to that question. And this then leads to a sort of third question that says, well, is it important to know what God thinks about it? If you have committed everything you're doing to God and God doesn't care about building spectrum analyzers, you may want to reconsider what you do with your day. And if he does care about spectrum analyzers, then you might really want to know what God thinks about spectrum analyzers, because that might have some impact in how you spend your time. So these are two questions, and if you don't know the answer to these two questions, it's a challenge for you for today. To as you go away to say, okay, well, what does God think about what I do? Because I'm pretty sure he has an opinion. So, ways of Christianity being involved in the academy. There are three ways that I want to discuss today. This is not an exhaustive list. This is not like a full, complete thing, but it's a sort of framework in which you can at least start thinking about the topics. So the first one is an intrinsic view of the way Christianity is involved in the academy. This is Christianity is involved, and you cannot do academic research any other way. The second is an implicit way, which is to say that Christianity is involved, and you can involve Christianity, but you don't particularly need to point to it and draw attention to it. You just do it. And the third is explicit, where Christianity is involved, and you point directly at it, and you say, this is a Christian idea. And I'm going to argue that all three of these have a place within the secular academy, that there are times when, as a secular academic within a secular research group, you can point directly to your Christian ideas and say, this is what Christianity says, and this has a place in this discussion. So, starting with intrinsic views, often good Christian practice is good academic practice. Um, so, for example, I only have 3 months of funding left. I don't know if you are yet in the position where you've encountered this, where the joy of academia is it can be quite precarious, and so you need to have peace. If your peace comes from your job security, you will never last as an academic. You need to have peace that comes from somewhere not connected to the fact that in 2 weeks' time your funding is going to run out and the university hasn't given you a new contract yet. Um, Things just take forever. Um, and in order to engage with this, you either go completely nuts or you foster within yourself patience. Um, you're doing a project and then someone offers you a new shiny project, and you can either go on do this new shiny project and leave your students in the lurch and leave your university in the lurch, or you can say, no, this project that I have committed to, I'm going to continue doing that because I have committed to it. This is showing faithfulness. Um, Sometimes you think you have a wonderful idea and you think that everyone should listen to your idea, but sometimes it's good to let your colleagues speak. And however good your idea is, you need to sit on your thumbs for a bit and just wait for other people to say things. And this takes self-control. So in each of these things, to to have peace, patience, faithfulness, self-control, this is part of being a Christian. And being a Christian makes in and fostering these virtues makes you a better academic. And on the flip side, being an academic gives you the opportunity to foster these virtues. So, as a Christian, and you're trying to foster them, cultivate these virtues in your life, academia gives you the opportunity to grow in these Christian virtues. This is a discipleship project. Um, so this is where Christianity just lines up with the academy. Now, there are also ways in which Christianity is involved. So these categories they blur into one another. So I'm not going to sit and carefully say, okay, do we need to draw attention to that, and so on and so forth. So this is they blur into each other. Um, but here's an example of the way in which Christianity can be implicit within the academy. So, for example, within the academy, we evaluate things. Always we evaluate things. University rankings. Where does NUS stand? And you don't care if NUS is a good university. What you care about is NUS a better university than Hong Kong U? Right? It doesn't matter if NUS is good or really good. What it matters is it better than the university of the person you're talking to? How many students do you have? When someone asks you this, it's not because they're interested to know that you have 25 students on your course. It's because they're like, oh, okay, I've got 50 students on my course. They know where they stand relative to you. Where do you publish? Do you publish in more established journals than me or not? When you say to your students, go to the top of the class, this is a ranking. Now, Christianity has a view on rankings. The disciples discussed rankings. They were trying to work it out. And when Jesus asked what they were discussing, they were so embarrassed because they recognized that it was a dumb thing to say. They didn't even couldn't bring themselves to answer Jesus' question. They went, right? When Jesus asked them, what were you talking about along the way? They'd been arguing about which one of them was the greatest. And so they didn't even answer him. Now, compare that to, rather than viewing comparative evaluations, let's view an academic body. This is a metaphor that we know. Within the academy, there are people that do novel research and people that do repeat studies. And the novel research, the first time to do it, gets in Nature, and the repeat studies get stuck in some lower journal. But you don't say, well, you mustn't do the repeat studies because they're not as high ranking. You say, well, someone needs to do the repeat studies. But if you're only living on rankings, then no one's going to volunteer to do the repeat studies. What's better, doing repeat studies or doing teaching? Someone needs to do grant writing, but no one gets like lots of praise for actually getting the money in. And Christianity has a way of thinking about this. We have a well fleshed out metaphor. You can imagine Paul saying, just as he says, if the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were doing novel research, where would the repeat studies be? Within Christianity, we have a way of thinking about good ways for the academy to work. which are better than thinking about comparisons and rankings. You don't have to point and say, I'm doing poor line theology here. You can just say, hey, why don't we think about our collaboration as a collaboration? Um, and finally, there are ways in which you can explicitly point to Christianity and say, this is a Christian idea and it belongs being discussed in the secular academy. An example of this, again, these are just examples. I'm not giving a full listing. You can probably think of other ways to do this. But one example is selecting questions. So there are technological questions. How could this be faster or cheaper or more profitable or more efficient? Right? If you say, I've just built a new battery and it charges faster, well, this is good. I've built a new battery and it's cheaper. Yes. I've built a new whatever. I've built a new way to cultivate biodiversity and it's more efficient. Right? These are justifications in and of themselves. If you can do something that ticks this box, people say, yes, that's good. And you can ask these questions, and people will always give you money to ask these questions. They're entirely valid questions, but they're not the only questions you can ask. You could ask, how could this be kinder? You could ask, if I implement this new way to increase biodiversity, who suffers because of this? I have a faster battery, but how does it lead to suffering? How can I mitigate the suffering that my new faster battery causes? How can this development I'm making be used to benefit the poor or the weak or the outcast? Just as questions about how can I make this faster are entirely valid, questions about who suffers and how I can mitigate suffering are also entirely valid. Now, if you only think in a sort of technological mindset, you might never ask these other questions. But Christianity prompts us to ask these questions. Taking, for example, from Isaiah, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and plead the widow's cause. And when people say, well, what do we mean by suffering? What's the nature of suffering? You can say, well, I have an entire worldview here which has a well-established, well thought out framework for considering suffering, for considering kindness. And you can bring Christianity to bear and say, if you want to understand the nature of suffering and how batteries can relate to that, let me bring a whole pile of moral philosophy we've spent 2,000 years doing. Um, Here is an example from the literature. This is actually one where I think Christianity is slightly behind the curve. Uh, I'm going to throw a lot of books up now. The slides are going to be available afterwards, or you can note them on the video. Please don't feel you have to write them all down now. But here are some examples of people where they say, let's look at technology, philosophy of technology, and let's look at how this affects the weak and the poor and the outcast. And interestingly, all of these books have been written in the last 10 years. And if you notice the authors, Kathy, Virginia, Shoshana, Wendy, Simone, these are like within philosophy of technology, it's a tremendously male field. And who knew? But women, and often women from ethnic minorities and immigrant women, have experiences of technology and have insights of how technology affects them that have been completely missed by rich, white, comfortable professors, male professors. So there's an entire field out there where people can say, hey, there is something that all you rich, white, Anglophone men have missed. And this is something, if we're just looking for faster, more efficient, cheaper, there's an entire field that we overlook. So another example of where Christian values can kick in, and this is something which Mary Ruth is going to pick up in the second talk, is looking at creation care. Here's another pile of books that have been written in the last decade and a half or so. Oh, actually, no, that goes back 2 decades now. Um, from everyone from Dave Bookless to the Pope. And this is something where Christianity really has something to say. I'm not going to say more about that because I don't want to steal Mary Ruth's thunder. But this is an active field where you can say caring for creation is important. And I can explicitly say, I will discuss Christian themes in this. They are just as valid and just as important as discussing themes that get raised by is it faster and cheaper? Now, maybe I haven't touched on the discipline that you're coming from. You say, I come from this discipline or that discipline. So to give you an example, to say, whatever discipline you're in, there exists research, there exist books on this. If you can't find a book, chat to the guys who are around you, the guys who organize this meeting. If between you can't work it out, get them to get in touch with me and we can dig something out. But for example, in science, in technology, in mathematics, in sociology, um, in the built environment, natural environment, built environment, law, finance, all of these books are written by Christian academics who are bringing Christianity to bear on their topic. Now, if these thoughts all seem a bit sciencey to you, it's okay. There's stuff going on in the arts as well. Now, for each of these, I have colleagues where I know they have set these books as required reading within their course, not because they're trying to convert their students to Christianity, but because they say, if the Beethoven and freedom, if you want to understand the music of Beethoven, you have to understand Beethoven's notion of freedom. And to understand Beethoven's notion of freedom, you have to understand his view of Christ and salvation. Not because you need to become a Christian, or at least for the purposes of this course, but because you have to understand it, because otherwise his music makes no sense. And so these books can be set within a course context because that is part of academic rigor within a secular university. Um, on a more general topic, if rather than going to within the specifics of a discipline, if you're saying, well, as a Christian in general within the academy, there are other books that you can read. I've had like reading groups that I've set up with students. So this is one from Rick Hove and Heather Holloman, A Grander Story. Um, A Grander Story is particularly looking at evangelism among academics. The outrageous idea of Christian scholarship is particularly looking at engaging with your discipline. And the two tasks of the Christian scholar is actually looking at both these two tasks of evangelism and engagement with the discipline. But these books are really easy. They're really nice and accessible. You can read them through, read them with friends, discuss them, see how it works out in your context. There are also, depending on where you're from, within your country or on your continent, there are places where you have academics working together, thinking about these subjects. So these are, I've just picked as examples, one from each continent, and these are for scientists, um, for global topics, and across disciplines. Here are examples of groups for academics. Um, Again, each of these groups, you can follow the link, you can get in touch with them. They're really helpful places to go for resources and chatting to people so you don't think, oh, I'm alone, I'm the only Christian in my department. I don't have anyone to talk to work out how to do this. There are resources out there, there are people out there that you can talk to. So with that much being said, these are, in summary, three typical ways in which you can bring your Christianity to bear within the secular academy. And I look forward to the remainder of this session as we get to pick up on some of these themes, also with Mary Ruth in a panel session later in the Q&A to sort of delve into some of these. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. I really appreciate it. Thank you also for drawing attention to the rich resources and tradition that we have as Christians to draw upon and to learn together with. So now we turn our attention to Mary Ruth. It gives me great joy to introduce Mary Ruth. Mary Ruth is one of the key reasons why I'm still part of the Christian Fellowship and why I'm even a staff worker with FES Singapore. So I've known her since I was in university. She was the one that brought me into the Christian Fellowship. But let me read for you a little blurb that I have of her, taken from Arusha. So Mary Ruth has always felt a deep love for God's created world. Early in her career, she worked in Malaysia and Singapore, researching and championing oft overlooked animals such as snakes, frogs, and bats. Over the years, she discovered a passion for storytelling, especially stories that invite people to feel hopeful in caring for our world. With a bachelor's in life sciences and a master's in ecological economics, she attempts to integrate both ecological insight and a systems approach in her communications role, where she's serving at Arusha, Canada. When not working, she enjoys cooking for people, reading, and getting her hands muddy on the potter's wheel. So Mary Ruth, please.
Thank you, Prati. Yeah, what a joy to be here. Thank you, Lisman and Prati, for inviting me. And thank you, Mike, for that really wonderful talk and introduction and groundwork to this topic. And I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Yeah, so the topic, the title of my talk is Learning to Pay Attention. And not to say I'm accusing anyone here of falling asleep or looking somewhere else, but you'll come to see why this theme of paying attention is so important to me and how I found it useful. Um, yeah, so I was that kid in class. When you're 8 years old and your teacher gives you an assignment, what do you want to be when you grow up? I was the one who was like, I love animals and I want to be a zoologist when I grow up. And my parents were really supportive. My dad was a pastor, but he studied zoology before becoming a pastor. So I think he kind of inculcated that love for the natural world in my brother and me. My brother's a historian in a natural history museum, so we're kind of in the same realm. And yeah, I growing up, I would always talk about animals, how I loved creatures. And growing up again, as a pastor's kid, there is some measure of spotlight on you in church growing up. And I did feel quite a bit of tension in that because I would talk about animals so much, and people in church would say, "Oh, but we're Christians, so it's about saving souls." And why are you put it? Why are you wanting to study zoology when you should be saving souls, right? Like we should be caring about how what we do in life contributes to mission work and humans, right? That was always the kind of that slant. And so there was a lot of tension within me, in how I understood my faith, right? Because I knew growing up that, you know, God created all these things and he loves them and he values them. And obviously this world is full of wonder. And yet in church, where I go every Sunday and try to live out my faith during the week, there's this conflict, there's this tension. And it was a point, as I in my late teens, as I was about to enter university, where I was so ready to give up on church, basically, right? Because it's like, well, I felt not that I was ready to give up on God, but in terms of church, there was quite a lot of tension there, and there was no one who could help me reconcile that. But as Prati mentioned, we met in Varsity Christian Fellowship at National University of Singapore. So that was where I did my bachelor's and where I spent nine formative years. I mean, sorry, I spent 9 formative years in Singapore from coming from Malaysia. And it was during those years, which I now look back and it's quite a long time ago, where I was introduced to this concept of integral mission. We were talking a lot about Chris Wright's book, The Mission of God, and a lot of what we talked about helped me reconcile these tensions that I talked about growing up, right? Like it's not it's not just about humans, right? We live in this world and the the new kingdom penetrates all of creation, all of reality. It's not just something that we do with regards to humans. So you can see Prati in the second photo there. She hasn't changed. But yeah, those were and also that was where I got to know this man quite well. So this is a very key time in my life that I think it was a turning point in my faith. Because otherwise I do think if I had continued and being so frustrated and not being able to find anyone who saw differently, I might have stopped attending church. Yeah. So from that, I kind of moved. I haven't stayed in the academy, so to say, like Dr. Like Mike. But I feel how I describe it is I kind of dance around the periphery. So I still publish nowhere near journal, really ranking journals, but you put work out there, which you hope people will read. And one of the things that I feel quite strongly about is this championing the underdog almost. So Prati mentioned this in the bio. Um, so I've worked with snakes, frogs, for example, and also bats. And when I worked with bats, that I think was also another talking about turning points or milestones. It came at a time when I was doing research on bats and how they are pollinators in Malaysia, and they fit the perfect underdog role because they are super key in pollinating a lot of the crops that we know and love, such as durian. For those of you who live in Southeast Asia, durian is the king of fruits, right? And without durian, oh sorry, without bats, you wouldn't get durian. But no one knows this. Everyone's happily eating durian, paying hundreds of dollars for the fruit, and the bats go unnoticed and unacknowledged. And there is a huge expansion happening now because the demand from China is so great, and people want to plant durian because it's the new cash crop. It's gold growing on trees, but they're not taking into account what is needed for a good crop, for a sustainable crop. And so we would talk a lot to farmers, and this was also around the time COVID happened, where bats were blamed for the disease, even though there was no concrete evidence, and there still isn't. But yeah, it was hard. It was hard trying to conduct research and create awareness about the importance because the pushback was so real. People just wanted to kill them. People were angry, and this has been a recurring kind of theme when I worked on snakes back in Singapore. Also, I would have Christian friends from like people say I meet in church. I meet them outside and they ask me about my work, and I would say, I work with snakes, and they'll be like, "Oh, that's something of the devil. We should kill them all." So it was it's been a recurring theme trying to champion for something that people really dislike and feel shouldn't be there. Um, so I think all these experiences, interactions, kind of shaped how I reach out to people, engage people in conversation, right? And it's also about connecting the dots because when people dislike something so much, you try to find ways where you can talk about them and find points of commonality. Um, and this also ties in with learning to be meek. So I think, and I will talk about this a bit later, but there's a lot of anger in how conservationists talk about things that are species that are going endangered, climate change, all the disasters that's happening. But how, as a Christian, what are the motivations for you to champion this message, and how do you go about it? So all these things tied together, and I'm really briefly going to go through the diagram at the bottom. So people know that elephants, maybe most people know that elephants help to disperse seeds, but bats disperse seeds by far way more than elephants. And again, no one knows, no one really understands or knows about them. So it's yeah, this recurring theme. So as I mentioned earlier, the seed of integrating mission, how I understand it today, and I think this will be a continuous learning journey for me, is um, always trying to understand the worldview. So that includes the philosophy, values, and history that undergirds the field of your studies. Commonality, so that's what I mentioned earlier about finding common ground when there's seemingly a lot of conflict. And how do you start a conversation, right? How do you be curious and um, fight that rather than starting from a place where you're at odds with each other? And leading on to that is building community. So with the people that you're with, whether you're collaborators, researchers, your group mates in this project, um, what are their needs and how can your own learning journey help them along the way and meet them where they are? So I'm gonna not I'm Mike gave a slew of really great book recommendations. These are the personal books that have helped me along the way, and I'm just gonna share about that. So, Anti Wright really helped me reconcile the what I mentioned about in my teens and people with more dispensationalist ideas of how this world's gonna go away anyway, so why are we polishing the brass on a sinking ship? I think that phrase was popularized by Jonathan Edwards, but it's not originally by him. Just want to be clear. Um, and I think N.T. Wright in his book, Surprised by Hope, he really talks about how the kingdom is here now, right? And how do we then rethink um, resurrection and reconciliation, and therefore the mission of the church. So this book really helped me in that. And it's centered, or he really quickly in the book introduces Colossians 1:15-20. And this is, I'm not going to read through all the verses, but if you look at the last sentence, so for in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. So knowing that all creation will be reconciled, it is not just humans, um, and it is made peace is made through the blood of the cross. So I think this verse has always been something that I hold very dear in my understanding of the world and how I live out my faith and work. This book by Nancy Pearcey, I know that Mike also introduced a book that was co-authored by her. This journey of preparing for this talk actually brought me on a throwback kind of path, because I had forgotten the title of this book, but I knew what the cover looked like, and it took me a while to find it. But this book was really instrumental for me, despite me not remembering the title, in addressing the split dichotomy of the sacred with the secular, right? So how do you understand what you're studying in the light of Christianity? And she kind of talks about how it really applies to all of reality in every single field of study that you might be looking at. So recommend this book, or maybe a lot of things. Anything written by Nancy Pearcey is a good one, I think. And Dark Green Religion by Brown Taylor. So obviously this is very contextualized to my field of conservation and people involved in, for example, climate change. So this book is not by a Christian author, but he does talk about Christians in conservation. And it really addresses some of the lenses that people are wearing when they are championing um, uh, the green message, right, to put it broadly, so environmentalism. And the last one, sorry, Prati, I'm aware of the time. I'm finishing last slide. So this is Circles and the Cross by Lauren Wilkinson. And it's a really big, broad overview. But I just wanted to pull out this this diagram, love a diagram, for sciencey people. So on the right arm of this little diamond are the humanities, right? And in this chapter, he talks about how the exploration of the human world, as much as we are focused on humans, is still very rooted in materiality, which is on the left arm, cosmology, astrophysics, and geology. And then the natural sciences on the left, as much as you can study them, they're still incomplete unless they engage with the metaphysics and the bigger question of theology. So again, I think whatever field you're studying, this kind of helps. At least for me, it gave a good overview of how it all fits together under this, the big, broad questions of metaphysics and theology. And my last quote is by Mary Oliver, one of my favorite poets. And this line from one of her poems really stuck with me, because she says to pay attention, this is our endless and proper work, right? And what does it mean to pay attention? I think it really sums up all my slides, right? It really talks about what undergirds your field of study when you're studying. What's the context it's in, and how do you then understand the kingdom that has come but is not yet fully reconciled here on earth now. And so it is an endless and proper work. It's proper because this is what Christ wants us to do. And it's endless because every day is a new day and things are changing. And so it's endless and you can always learn new things. So yeah, that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Ruth. I love the invitation to pay attention. And I love also the new perspective that's offered in attending to the underdog, and the underdog that is the bat, which we may not often think when we associate with underdogs. So right now it's 9:10. I want to give us a 5-minute pause or break before we enter the panel conversation. And I hope that you would use this time to think through the things that both speakers have raised, the kind of framework that might offer us in terms of intrinsic, implicit, and explicit tension within the Christian framework for attending or to your academic field, and also Mary Ruth whole sharing both personalized to her, but also in inviting us to pay attention. So you do have, as I put here on the chat. So after the panel conversation, you will have some time to ask your question. So you can again feel free to message Lisman your question, ask in your own language, or later on, if you so desire, you can raise your hand and I will call upon you. But now, so maybe we can take a break until 9:15, but don't leave the Zoom call. So still stay in the Zoom call, yeah, so that we can continue promptly at 9:15. Thanks, Mike. So we brought up normative claims, but I wanted to go back to something that you said earlier to maybe explain it a little bit more for our audience, if you don't mind. So you raised the issue of, not the issue, but the thing that how as Christian academics, we are all learning to be Christian academics, we have the capacity or opportunity to ask teleological questions. Could you explain that a little bit more for us? What would that mean?
Okay, so teleology is looking at the end, the purpose, the reason for doing something. And so within Newtonian mechanics, you have two atoms and an atom hits another atom and bounces off another atom. And there's no reason for it. There's no purpose for it. It's just atoms doing what atoms do. And so within a Newtonian perspective of physics, say, you can't ask the question, why did the atom do this? What was it trying to achieve? What was the purpose of this? And a sort of reductionist view can then say, okay, if we build the universe up and the universe is just lots of atoms doing what lots of atoms do, we can't ask questions about purpose, meaning, reason.
Mm.
And this really hamstrings a lot of science. There are all sorts. I mean, if you want to go into the maths and the physics of it, right? Lagrangians, you minimize your Lagrangian, right? This is a teleological argument, and we pretend it's not. So you can frame physics teleologically, you really can, but we just pretend that we don't. And even for if you take evolutionary biology, if you look at why does this animal have, how do I reassemble this skeleton? Historically, like paleontologists who didn't have access to the genetics and so on and so forth said, I can still assemble this skeleton because I know the legs go on the bottom because the legs are for walking. Whereas now, when you say, okay, no, the legs are go where they go just because that's where the genes make them go and the way the proteins fold and so on and so forth. And so, because we have this sort of bottom up, there is no purpose approach, we
Mm.
now say if we don't have access to the genetics, we don't know how to put the animal together. Whereas, in fact, if you permit a thing that says there are reasons for this, I can put the animal back together exactly because I know its gut has to be attached to its mouth because otherwise, how would it eat? Um, so these are examples of, and then of course, there's questions of purpose and reason and providence through history. It flows throughout the entire academy.
All right, thanks, Mike. And so I think what you're both saying in some ways is that Christians exist to ask better questions, or questions that may have been lost, at least within the way that we think about disciplines. And so I think that that leads somewhat to the next question, which is that often we have lost sight of Christian roots within the university. So how can we cultivate this way of exploring our disciplines or field of study Christianly? And this would be particularly, I think you've touched upon this a little bit within your talk, but particularly, for yourselves, how have you learned to cultivate that? Mary Ruth, would you like to go first?
Sure. I did talk about this in my slides, and it's really um I think well, one way is to say approach it critically, but what does critically mean from a Christian
Mm,
perspective, right? So, for example, when I was in university studying my bachelor's, and you learn about evolutionary biology, but then so you have these theories and the concepts, but then I think going deeper and understanding the worldviews and the values that
mm,
the scientists themselves held when they came up with the theories is important um, for then understanding what you're learning today. So it's really learning about the history, how science came about. The history of science, I think, should be compulsory for every science student, for example, but it's not. And a lot of people disregard that. The
mm.
philosophy of science also. So ways like that. And the other part of your question, what would it look like to explore our discipline Christianly? I think I'm going to use an example from my master's. I just have one. I'm kidding. Um, and this was when I did ecological economics, and
Mhm.
not too long ago, 3 years ago at the University of Leeds. And for a lot of people who know me and animals, I'm like, why are you doing a master's in economics? But I think it was over the years realizing that people don't speak the language of, or what's the currency that people speak, right? And it's money,
Mhm.
right? That's how the world runs. And so I think I really wanted to understand that. And as I looked into economics and how it was applied to biology, it was very quite one-dimensional in the sense that, oh, for example, we have this patch of forest, we want to conserve it. How do biologists try and conserve it? They try to put a price on it. And so this patch of forest is worth $1 billion. And so therefore, if you cut it down, you lose that money, right? But then what the problem was with that is that when you put a value, a price tag on a patch of forest, what if the minerals that you want to mine for iPhones, for example, underneath that patch of forest is worth then more than $1 billion? Then obviously,
Mm.
with that comparison, you're going to cut down the forest because the minerals are worth more. And so I was quite unsatisfied with that. But I think the field of ecological economics, which falls under the new school of what they call heterodox economics, which is different from the old school, the old white man kind of economics. Sorry to use that one. Yeah, but in ecological economics, they really think about inequalities, right, between global north and global south countries, whether even GDP is worth
Mm.
using as the main form of comparison between the different countries' economy. So even though it's not in explicitly Christian, I think the study of heterodox economics, for example, is thinking about economics Christianly because it incorporates like values of justice,
Mm.
mercy, and it doesn't always have to be. There are Christians in this field, but I think really recognizing the academics who are thinking with these values in mind
Mm.
should also excite Christians and want Christians to kind of jump in on that and say, yes, this is the kind of work that we should be doing.
Mm.
Yes,
Thanks,
Mike over.
Meredith.
Yeah.
Mike. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I fully agree with Mary Ruth on the importance of history and philosophy in understanding this. The way
Mm.
particularly scientists are taught their discipline is really good for helping you pass science exams, but not necessarily good for making you a good scientist, and certainly not very good for making you a good human being. So sort of reading broadly around your subject, digging into that is helpful. Um,
Mm.
one that I was a tip that I was given when I was an undergraduate student. Someone said, "Okay, take a Bible that you're happy to draw on and read it cover to cover and highlight everything that is relevant to your studies and your discipline."
Wow.
Um, and I'm like, okay, well, quantum mechanics, here we go. It's actually, I mean, it's no bad exercise to just read the entire Bible cover to cover. But also when you start looking at it and you go, there is stuff in here which is actually relevant. And it just is a provocation then to help you think more broadly. Because often we sort of, because of the way we read our Bible and the way we sort of think about our Bible study in quiet time and so on and so forth, doesn't provoke us to think about our subject through a Christian lens. And so to really actively read your Bible in a way that says, how does this engage with my discipline? What does this mean? I found a helpful exercise.
Thanks, Mike. So we're going to get to the last bunch of questions before we move to a time of question and answer with the audience. So you've already touched upon some of this, reading your Bible provocatively, if I may say, paraphrase. Meredith even talked about the challenges of understanding the assumptions that undergird your field of study. And both of you have also talked at length about the importance of asking good questions, or Christians being able to insert themselves into conversations and bringing these kinds of questions with them, or even recognizing or affirming questions that exist already in academia and jumping on that and being excited about that. But what are some habits that you would recommend for us to learn to ask these questions, better questions or good questions on what we are learning? And what are some approaches in which we can take to learning? And what can we do? What should we do when what we're learning seems to be at conflict with what our existing faith positions are? Recognizing, of course, that those might shift. Mike, do you want to go
I'll dive
first?
in on this one.
All
Okay.
right.
Maybe I'll pick up on the third one first.
Okay.
With, and again, so coming from a science background, the idea of what happens when science and religion disagree is always a thorny issue. And a lot of like there's historically, traditionally, there's been, I say historically, over the last century and a half, so there's been this idea that science and religion are somehow in conflict. And a lot of work has been done to debunk that, to say that actually the conflict doesn't work out the way you think it does. There isn't this clash. You can be both a scientist and a Christian. Now, I think if anything, and this is where I sort of the experience I have coming in as a philosopher of science, if anything, the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction that says there is no dispute between science and religion.
Mm.
And I think that once you've got over the idea that says they're always in conflict and they're at war and you can't be a science and a Christian, okay, we've got over that. But then we need to put in the idea that says actually science and religion can and at times should disagree with each other. As a Christian, you can't just stand there and say, well, science says this, so I'm going to accept it because like science is religiously neutral. And so these science just gives us the facts and we have to work out how our religion works with that. There is a position where religion can appropriately press back against science. So we recognize that our religious position may change, but also that the whole joy of science is science is not a done deal. It is an evolving, tentative, speculative study. Science can also change. And there are times when we say, I'm going to push back against this. Also because the nature of science is there's this sort of thin view that says science only deals with facts, but science is this rich interplay of also containing normative ideas, containing lots of different things which are integrally part of science. And you can't just strip them out and that's not real science.
Mm.
So for example, the notion of free will. You say if neuroscience says I can describe everything you do in terms of chemicals and electropotentials and so on and so forth. Therefore, you have no free will. Christianity, I think, can rightly push back and say it may be the case that you have a model which perfectly describes everything that's going on in terms of chemicals and electropotentials. And yet, I hold that humans have free will and agency and moral responsibility. And I think it's right and appropriate that Christians should at times push back against science and say this isn't describing the thing that you think it's describing.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I think just to build on that, as we sort of meld into the time of question and answer as well. So that was one of the questions that was raised is what if science contradicts to what the Bible says? And so you've very helpfully pointed out that we're getting over the fact that we're drawing this dichotomy, like the two cannot exist in the same sphere. But But now we also need to be more nuanced and thoughtful in the way that we think about sometimes having a faith position and pushing back, and also recognizing that science is not this like monolith or only dealing with objective facts. Ruth, do you have anything to add on, or maybe a response to some of the other questions?
Yeah. I feel like I did talk about this a little bit in my slides about,
Yep.
having paying attention, the whole thing, the whole theme, really. But one thing I wanted to kind of go back to is really Mike's slides about, um oh, how Mike brought up intrinsic, implicit, and explicit
Mm,
in having the Christian view in science in the academy. So I think,
mm,
having just riffing on that theme, I think also, in our posture, so approaches, right? Approaches to learning. I think it's also maybe adopting that is a I kind of like that pattern. So I think it's reading the room, and the context that you're in. And as Christians, I don't think we need to be explicit in every single context, but also understanding when is it right to be to live out your Christian values and faith intrinsically, implicitly and explicitly. And there are different settings and contexts for which that would be the best and ideal and perhaps the wisest, right? And so just, again, paying sorry, paying at the sound at the danger of sounding like a broken record, it's really paying attention to the people who are you are learning with, the people who are you're learning from. And again, trying to relate to them, right? And understanding, points of commonality and what lenses they're wearing. So I think all these things are many factors that will then contribute to then how you respond in each situation of how you're learning. Yeah.
mm. Thanks, Mary Ruth. I think just to, if I could just take up that point. So you talked about being able to read the room, right, and recognizing the context, and so we have a question here that is coming back to asking Mike about that point about intrinsic aspect of Christianity in academia. So if I just read out the question. What's the significance of this aspect of intrinsic aspect of Christianity in academia, since it's not unique to Christianity according to the non-Christian world? So values like patience isn't known to be a uniquely Christian value, for example. Is that come back to the notion of being created in the image of God, and thus being able to display these values? Could you elaborate more on why this is critical for our engagement?
Okay. Um, Wonderful question. So yeah, I suppose I'm going to maybe answer it from two different directions. One is it's potentially worth saying, because I have heard people take the opposite position that says in a secular university I cannot proselytize. I'm not allowed to encourage people to become Christians. I can't make my Christianity attractive. Now, everyone in my department is bitter and twisted and biting and gossips. If I extend grace to my colleagues, people will say, "Wow, you're such a helpful, kind person." They'll ask me why it is that I can be so gracious. And then my Christianity will be attractive, and then maybe they'll want to become a Christian. And I can't promote Christianity within the academy. Therefore, although I am a gracious person in principle, I will pretend to be bitter and twisted and backbiting and gossip because that's an appropriate action in the secular academy. Now, clearly, clearly, this is bonkers. But so I mean, hopefully no one on this call would take a position like that because you're all well-adjusted, intelligent people. Um, but we have this view that, like, I mean, it's just important to say, like, there are Christian things that we can and should and must do within the academy. And if that sets us at odds with the way our colleagues are, so be it. So that's one point. The question with respect to the uniqueness of it,
Mm,
I think we need to be okay with aspects of Christianity not being unique. You kind of get caught between two stools. One is people say, well, other religions believe this too, so it's not special to Christianity, so you don't need to invoke Christianity. Or where Christianity is unique, it's like only Christians believe that. You can't bring it into a common discussion across different religions, therefore we're going to ignore that bit. And so people want to have their cake and eat it and exclude us from both sides. If it's unique, then there's no shared perspective. So Christianity can be ignored. And if it's not unique, well, everyone shares it, so Christianity can be ignored. Um, but I think to say these things are shared across different perspectives, maybe with different nuance to them, maybe with different subtleties, maybe being motivated by slightly different things. Why are we patient? Why do we have peace? And so Christianity has a certain grounding on that. But nonetheless, to say I'm very happy for my Buddhist friends to also engage in a peaceful, gracious way with the academy. But that is not to take away from the fact that it is my Christianity which motivates my grace and my peace.
Mm. Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I think it'd probably also be worth exploring why and how Christianity motivates those kinds of values and what makes them, what brings that Christian nuance to those
Yeah.
values as well.
And
Yeah.
and within as churches and other organizations engage with it, as you're trying to disciple people, as you're trying to disciple academics,
Mhm.
there are particular aspects of peace where academics struggle in particular ways. There are aspects of humility where academics struggle with humility in very specific weird circumstances which don't crop up elsewhere. And
Mm.
so I think as a church, we need to recognize that to have a distinctively Christian engagement so that we can help Christians in their discipleship journey with the virtues that they need to develop really is important.
Thank you. I have a slightly different question on quite a different track, which is knowledge obtained through inhumane means worth appreciating? Is knowledge obtained through inhumane means worth appreciating? And what is inhumane was not articulated, but there's quite a lot of inhumanity, I imagine. ChatGPT usage, etc.
Um, I'm thinking that's maybe directed at me. Ruth, is there something you want to dive in on that, or shall I see if I can come up with some thoughts? Okay. Oh, that's a wonderful question, and it's really, really hard. Um, I think one of the things to recognize is that a lot of knowledge is created by inhumane means. And there's some really standout things, like, for example, what do we do about the scientific data that was achieved during the Holocaust?
Mm.
Um, and I believe within the medical community there are some pretty strong views on that that says that data is taboo. We will not use it. It may be true and accurate and even helpful medical data, but that is viewed out of bounds for our use because of the way it was obtained, and there is an argument for that. Um, on the other hand, I think that if you look at the richness and breadth of inhumanity within the academy, um, you know, the academy runs on students having tremendously precarious existences, postdocs having tremendously precarious existences. We pay them as little as we can with as few guarantees as possible, and we send them into the lab and get them to work long hours for fame and glory. Um, and so there is an argument that says that if we don't take knowledge gained by inhumane means seriously, we basically have to exclude all of academic knowledge because
Oh boy.
the academy can be brutal. I think there is an argument that says we must work as hard as we possibly can to make the academy humane,
Mhm.
and we must also recognize the value of the knowledge that we have gained by oppression and exploitation. And we we rightly lament how it was obtained, but don't for that reason alone disregard it. Though I understand that this is a discussion and different people take different views on that.
Mary Ruth, do you have anything to add on to that?
No, I think Mike summed it up really good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I think I'm going to just open the time if anyone wants to ask their question out loud. I understand it might be, yeah, you're most welcome to unmute and ask a question if you have any. Okay, I feel like I've waited an appropriate amount of time. I'll go back. So we have received another question um, where a student has asked that their project is to teach an underprivileged primary school girl how to learn mathematics. How can this student encourage her to do so in light of the Christian faith that she has?
I think this is a question for you, Mike.
No.
Um, so there's various ways in which this can be done. I mean, one is there is an appropriate place for enjoyment and wonder and joy. Um, I mean, so with looking if people mathematicians enjoy maths, looking for patterns, looking for the way things hang together, and to 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 take my when my kids are learning something, the when they learn it, I don't need to learn it. I know it already. I enjoy sitting with them and spending time with them while they learn it. And this is good father-child time. And to view the learning of mathematics as saying, hey, God is here with you as you are learning it. And he takes pleasure in the pleasure that you take learning mathematics. And to recognize that it's not like you've got your Christian time with God when you're reading your Bible and you're trying to preach the gospel to people, and you've got your secular time when God doesn't care, where you're just learning your times tables. But to sit and take pleasure in the patterns within your times tables is an appropriate aspect of time with and worship towards God. Um, and I mean that opens up a whole pile of directions one could go in, but that's a start, I suppose.
Yeah, I love that. Take pleasure in the patterns of your times tables. And I don't think I've ever heard that expressed in that way. And it's quite a nice notion, I think, that God takes pleasure in the patterns of times tables as well. I think we'll come to the end of our time for today, but I want to end on a question that perhaps Mike can answer first, and then Mary Ruth can answer next, so that we end with a woman's voice. But a question has been raised about, has your academic journey, your studies or research or teaching challenged, weakened, or strengthened your Christian faith? And I suppose you can answer both.
Okay. Yes, it has challenged, strengthened. I'm not going to say weakened. It's shifted. It has changed it. Um, my view of Christianity when I was at school is very different to my view of Christianity now. Um, when I was doing my theology masters, as I was digging into sort of the shifts that happened across sort of early modernism through into modernism, the Enlightenment, what happened to theology, what happened to philosophy of science. Picking up as Mary Ruth said on the history and philosophy of science. I mean, this is what I was doing in my theology degree. And my tutor kept on coming back to me. It's like, Mike, you know your salvation is secure, right? He was genuinely concerned, bless him, that I was just losing my faith. And I'm like, I'm not losing my faith. I'm just realizing that the way I understood it before may not carry as much weight as it actually needs to. Um, so it's shifted. Um, and and I think strengthened, certainly enriched.
Thank you, Mike. Mary Ruth?
I just wanted to say in response to Mike, I'm so glad you had a mentor who was looking out
Mhm.
for you because not many people have that. Um, I would say on the part on enriched, for sure, as you heard in my story, my faith has come a long way from being quite compartmentalized to a lot more um integrated. And um, I think my role, I haven't talked about this, but my role now doing communications at Arosha in Canada. So for those of you who don't know, Arosha is a Christian conservation organization, and I think the only one in the world or that that's at least that's international. And so in terms of explicit, the organization is explicit about its Christian values as its mission for creation care. Um, and I think I've only been in this role with this organization for the past 3 months, but I have had interactions with Arosha, and it's been a very core part of my journey as well, with the books that they've published and things like that from the founders and people who've worked there. But what I was going to say is, I think just being in this organization and being in this community, it's really helped me. It's almost like this journey, this dance that I've been through. So, from this kid loving animals, but seemingly at odds with mission and saving souls, to in the concept of integrated mission, and then now working in Russia, I feel really thankful and grateful that I am living this out now in this role. So I'm doing communications, which a lot of people will also say, "What, you were a biologist and why are you doing communications now?" But I think for me it's a perfect role, and I'm so grateful that God has brought me here. But it's really being able to tell stories, but having that background of biology and economics. And so when you tell the story, right, you are integrating and putting the patterns of what I've learned together in trying to invite people into this movement to not movement this part of faith that we are doing together to care for creation. And so it's enriched in that way. I yeah, I don't really have the weekend thing, but it's more of a shifting, I would say. So one example would be, I think before this it was very black and white in terms of the Christian journey or how I viewed it back in the before it was integrated. And so now I look for points of commonality in people whom I interact with who might not share my same Christian journey, and a lot of people do not. And then how do you then also realize that God is working in their lives in some way, not in the way that you expect or know about, but trusting that God is also they're on their own journey with God, and how do you, with knowing the grace of Christ, how do you then share that with them where they are? So that's what I would say.
Thank you so much, Mary Ruth. And thank you also for your life, because thanks to the way that you were thinking about integrating your faith and academics, you drew me into that conversation as well when I was a young undergraduate. We have a final question on the chat. If I could just read it. So, good evening to both of you. This is Xavier. He's working on a project to create activated carbon to purify water for a village, and it's brought up certain tensions within him what he's been wrestling with. So in science, success appears to be measured by data, whether or not his project is effective. But in our faith, we talk so much about faithfulness and obedience. So the question is, how should a Christian scientist frame the idea of failure in an experiment? If his project doesn't succeed technically, does that mean he has also failed in his act of discipleship? And how do we reconcile these academic benchmarks for success with a call to be faithful to God regardless of the outcome? I think both of you are qualified to respond to this.
I can go first.
Go for it.
Thanks, Xavier, for your question. It's a really sounds like a great project that you're doing. When I was still doing research full time, I think it is very common in the academy, the Ivory Tower Academy, to get a positive significance result. And I think over time, as I matured in how I approach research, failure, quote unquote, or not the result that you want to see, I would put it the other way, is also still a result of your hard work. and I wouldn't I think academics shouldn't discount that. There's a journal I think of, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but it's not highly ranked, but it's Journal of Negative Results, right? Which when I discovered that, I was so overjoyed because people hype up the result that you want, and then they don't publish the results that they didn't ideally get. And that's science for you, right? So if you think about again how we approach science, it's become this glory seeking high ranking paper thing, which is problematic. And so I would say no, you are still obedient. And the the problem is the academic benchmark. And so it's rethinking what those benchmarks are about and why they are there, and how then, as a Christian, how are you living out and approaching those benchmarks? Yeah.
Thank you, Mary. Mike?
Yeah, I absolutely second how what Mary says. There's three things going on. There's the success or failure, so-called, of your experiment. Well, four things. There's the success or failure of your experiment. Do you find out information that you wanted? And did it work is not the same as did I find out information that I wanted, because an experiment cannot do what you expect but still give you information. Then it's a successful experiment. Question two is the success or failure of your technology. Does it clean the water in the way that you wanted? And so your technology can succeed or fail. And that's completely independent of whether your experiment succeeds or fails, which is completely independent of whether or not your experiment gave you the result you expected. And then, as Mary Ruth pointed out, that those are completely independent from whether or not you get the accolades of being recognized or called a good scientist. And a lot of, two scientists might be equally careful and fastidious and so on and so forth, but one happens to work on a topic which leads to the discovery of a new particle, and one happens to work on a topic which leads to the savings of 100 lives in a village somewhere. And you don't get a Nobel Prize for saving lives in a village somewhere, you get a Nobel Prize for discovering a new particle. But that's not to say that this is worse science in an important sense. And then you have the question of whether or not you're following what you're called to. And if God says, I want you to go to this village and sequence the genes of this banana, right? Far be it from you to say, but I'd like to go and do this other bit of science, right? There's being faithful to what God has called you to. And that may involve not being recognized for your science. And that may nonetheless require you to do really, really good science, just something that doesn't get you high ranking publications. And one of the joys of being a Christian is you get to sit with that, and you get to be okay with that.
Thank you. Thank you for that insight. And I hope that encourages Xavier on the project, on all of them, on their projects that they're embarking on. So it's 10 o'clock. We've come to the end of our night. Please join me in giving thanks for our great speakers and for the way that you have so hospitably offered insight to all of us here today. Thank you for your graciousness and for your wisdom and for bringing us in a little way on the journeys that both of you have been on in this journey of integrating faith and academics. So just a note to all our participants here today, because this meeting is recorded, we will upload this on YouTube just in case you need to revisit it and hear it again. And also think through for yourself some of the insight that has been offered today and how that makes sense within your context. To end off, I would like to close us in an adapted prayer. So this is a liturgy for students and scholars taken from the Rabbit Room, Every Moment Holy. I will just close us in prayer. So will you join me in prayer? May I love to love learning, O Lord. For the world is yours, and all things in it speak, each in their way of you, of your mind, your designs, your artistry, your power, your unfolding purpose. All knowledge is your knowledge, all wisdom your wisdom. Therefore, as I apply myself to learning, may I be mindful that all created things are your creative expression, that all stories are held within your greatest story, that all disciplines of order and design are a chasing after your thoughts, so that the greater mastery of these subjects will yield even greater knowledge of the symmetry and wonder of your ways. Along this journey, O great architect of life and beauty, bless me with teachers who are passionate about the subjects they teach, and with mentors who take joy in awakening in me a fierce love for those parts of your creation and your story that they have already learned to love well. As I apply myself to these subjects, what I find that I might first find tedious, reward me with new insight, fresh inspiration, small wonders, and the firm conviction that you are at work in us in all circumstances, not only broadening my knowledge, but also shaping my heart by patience, endurance, and discipline, that I may mature to more fitly and humbly serve the purposes of your great kingdom. Let us in this school, even in small ways, be a bearer of love and light and reconciliation. Let us in humility be your children. God, grant us, your children, discernment and wisdom. Guard us from error. God, grant this children, your children, knowledge and understanding. Lead us to truth. God, bless the labors of this new season. Shape us for your service. Amen. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a good night or a good day for our speakers.